Hi there, it's great to see you. Thanks for stopping by today. I really appreciate it. I'm John Merriman, and this is your Tuesday morning guitar song. Back in the day, as you may remember, it was very hard to think of the Beatles as being common people like you and me. It was hard not to think of them as being some godlike creatures for whom the common laws of life were totally suspended, that they didn't magically draw the golden ticket for life, where they had a carefree existence where every day was a picnic and every night was a party. I think the tragic shooting of John Lennon kind of sobered us up to this type of thinking. But it was still very hard to think of the Beatles as having everyday challenges and needs like you and I have. Well, the story of Wings, I think, brings this back down to earth a bit more, especially for Paul. Here's the story. It was 1969. The Beatles were coming apart from the inside. Paul had just married a young American photographer, and she was going to end up saving Paul's emotional life. The next year, 1970, Paul and Linda had their first child, Mary. And as still a Beatle, Paul released his first solo album. It was the homemade DIY album, McCartney. And the critics just railed on him. They hated it and they panned it. And Paul took his first major defeat very hard. Well, later that year, the Beatles blew apart. And Paul tried again with a second solo album, and the critics were more vicious than the first time around. And to top that year off, he ended up suing his lifelong friends and companions to get out of the restrictive contracts he had with them and the totally dysfunctional Apple Corp. Well, Paul was being very real and down to earth during those days. He was coming apart emotionally. Him, Linda, baby Mary, Heather, who was Linda's child from her first marriage, disappeared into a very remote part of Scotland. If Scotland could have a wilderness, this would have been it. They went to Paul's farm on the Kintyre Peninsula. It was an old, dilapidated, neglected sheep farm. Their only link to civilization was their trusty old Range Rover that they gave the name Helen Wheels. It was very primitive living, and there Paul went into a very serious depression. He fell apart. He could not get out of bed. He was deep into substance abuse. He could not change his own clothes. And it was Linda, with her steady love and patience, that saw him through. She kept the family together under very tough living conditions. She had faith in him. She encouraged him. And slowly, step by step, she returned him to the land of the living. And for that, he has said he is eternally grateful. He started living again. He said, oh my God, I got to get going. I got to start where I am. So he started trying to fix up his old farm. He put on his boots. He started pouring cement foundations. He started fixing the roofs. He started shearing his own sheep, mowing his own pastures, and the creative juices started returning to Paul. And then he had an inspiration one night. It hit him. He said, I want to start over, totally over. I want to start a band. And he asked Linda, he goes, do you want to be in the band? And she was amusical. She had never played an instrument or had any musical training. And she said, sure. And they called up some old friends to have them come up to Scotland and hang out. And they set up some equipment out in the garage. And they played old rock and roll songs and just hung out. There was only one rule, and that was the B word would never be mentioned. Well, Paul had finally reinvented himself a bit. He started a garage band in Scotland. So they played and they hung out, and like every garage band, they wanted to get out of the garage. So here's what they did. This is great. They bought some old vans. They loaded up these vans with guitars and amps and kids and pets and wives and diapers, and they just headed off down the road. They had no itinerary, no schedule, no gigs, no nothing. They didn't know where they were going to go. They just drove until they got to a college campus, any college campus. And there, unannounced, they would go in and ask if they could play. Well, this was still Paul McCartney, and people were dumbfounded, and of course the answer was yes. So they'd unload the vans, they'd set up, and they'd play a show. And they'd charge 50 pence. That's about $1.25 to see this band. It didn't even have a name then. And they did that for the summer. They just drove from campus to campus. And Wings started to come together, this new band of Paul. Well, they got back to the farm, and they go, well, that was pretty fun. We want to go to the next level. So they started booking some gigs in small venues around Europe. And they bought themselves a double-decker old bus with the top taken off. So it had 2 levels, but no top on the top. And they loaded it up again. Kids, pets, diapers, everything. And they took off for this tour of small venues around Europe. And that's where Wings really finally came together. Some people kind of went and came and went. But Paul's music came alive again. They got back to the farm, they started recording, and the rest is history. As you know, Wings became another monumentally popular band for Paul. But he started out at a garage band level and worked through all the steps to reinvent himself and brought his music to a brand new generation. Some of these kids were so young, they had never even heard of his first band. What was the name of that band? Well, whatever. Anyway, now Paul is still going strong, and today he is the topic of your Tuesday morning fun fact. Here's your Tuesday morning fun fact. In 1971, Paul and Linda had to return to London from their farm in Scotland for the birth of their second child. On September 13th, while in London, Linda had to be rushed to King's College Hospital for an emergency cesarean because of very serious complications with her pregnancy. Her condition and the baby's condition were critical, and their survival was touch and go. Paul says he started praying constantly, and while he was praying, he received a vision of his mother who had died when he was a young boy. His mother's name was Mary. She was a nurse and a midwife, and she assured him that everything would be okay. And in this vision, she was surrounded by big golden wings, which made quite an impression on Paul. Well, mother and baby came through just fine, and when they returned to their farm in Scotland, their garage band was notified of their new name. And that's your Tuesday morning fun fact. Let's go back to 1973. Paul McCartney and Wings, one of my favorite bands. Please don't go away. I'll be right back. Thank you so much for stopping by today. I really appreciate it, and it is so good to see you. Please remember to like the show, share it on your social media if you have a second, or send it to somebody if you know they like guitar music. Come back and see me next week. And remember, you're never ready for your day without a song in your heart. Bye now.